Self-respect is often praised in words but punished in reality. And most people never realize this until they begin practicing it consistently. Because the moment you stop over-explaining, stop tolerating subtle disrespect, stop reacting emotionally, and stop lowering your standards to keep others comfortable, something invisible but powerful shifts around you. Conversations feel colder, invitations slow down, energy changes, and suddenly you are no longer as welcome as you once were, not because you became cruel, but because you became clear. And clarity threatens systems built on confusion. And the silent samurai understood this long before modern psychology gave it language, because every hierarchy, every group, every relationship unconsciously relies on predictable behavior. And when you break that pattern by choosing self-respect over approval, you disrupt an unspoken agreement. The agreement that says you will stay small enough to be convenient, flexible enough to be manipulated, and quiet enough to be ignored when necessary. And once you no longer play that role, the group must adjust or resist, and most choose resistance, not openly but quietly, through distance, subtle judgment, passive comments, and emotional withdrawal. Because self-respect exposes what others tolerate in themselves, and people do not like mirrors that reflect uncomfortable truths. And this is why self-respect feels lonely at first, because it removes you from familiar emotional economies, where your value was based on availability, compliance, and emotional labor, rather than presence, boundaries, and consistency. And this transition is painful, not because you are wrong, but because your nervous system was trained to associate belonging with self-abandonment. And breaking that association feels like loss, even when it is actually liberation. And the samurai experienced this during initiation, when they were separated from crowds, comforts, and validation, because strength cannot be built in environments that reward weakness. And modern society is no different. It rewards people who bend, appease, and absorb discomfort silently, while punishing those who withdraw access, enforce boundaries, and refuse emotional chaos. And once you begin respecting yourself, you stop laughing at jokes meant to diminish you. You stop responding immediately to emotional demands. You stop negotiating your values to avoid conflict. And these small shifts accumulate into a presence that others feel but cannot control. And loss of control breeds resentment, not admiration, because admiration requires humility, and resentment requires none. And so people label you changed, cold, distant, or arrogant, not because those labels are accurate, but because they soothe their discomfort, allowing them to externalize the tension your self-respect creates inside them. And this is the first social cost of self-respect: misinterpretation, being misunderstood by those who benefited from your previous lack of boundaries. And this misinterpretation hurts deeply at first, because humans are wired for social belonging, and rejection activates the same neural circuits as physical pain. But the samurai trained to endure this pain intentionally, because the alternative was far worse: a life lived in quiet self-betrayal, where peace is constantly exchanged for approval, and identity dissolves into roles assigned by others. And once you see this clearly, you realize that discomfort is not evidence of error, it is evidence of transition, the nervous system recalibrating to a new standard. And this recalibration period is where most people retreat, apologizing for boundaries, softening standards, and returning to emotional availability to restore social harmony. But harmony built on self-sacrifice is not harmony. It is slow erosion, and erosion always ends in resentment, burnout, or quiet despair. And the silent samurai chose isolation over erosion, because isolation sharpens, while erosion weakens. And this choice does not make life easier, it makes it cleaner, removing false connections and revealing which relationships were built on respect versus access. Because self-respect filters your social world, exposing who values you for who you are versus who valued you for what you provided emotionally. And this filtering feels like loss only because you were never taught to differentiate between connection and attachment. But attachment thrives on insecurity, while connection thrives on mutual respect.
And once you step into self-respect, attachment patterns collapse because they require your compliance to survive. And this collapse often happens quietly, not with confrontation, but with distance, unanswered messages, reduced warmth, and subtle exclusion. And while this silence feels personal, it is structural, a system adjusting to the removal of a stabilizing element. Because when you stop absorbing tension for others, they must confront it themselves. And most people are not prepared to do that, and so they drift away rather than adapt. And this is why self-respect feels like walking alone at first, because it removes emotional crutches from others and from yourself, forcing growth on both sides. And growth is rarely mutual, because not everyone wants to change. And the samurai accepted this reality without bitterness, understanding that self-respect does not guarantee popularity, it guarantees alignment. And alignment is more valuable than acceptance, because acceptance without alignment costs you yourself. And once you lose yourself, no amount of belonging can compensate. And this realization marks the end of people-pleasing, the end of over-explaining, and the beginning of quiet authority. Authority not granted by titles or approval, but earned through consistency and self-command. And this authority does not announce itself, it is felt, often resisted, but eventually respected by those capable of meeting it. And this is why the first phase of self-respect feels socially expensive, because it demands payment up front. Loneliness, misunderstanding, and emotional discomfort, before it returns dividends in the form of clarity, peace, and unshakable self-trust. And this trade-off is unavoidable because you cannot maintain self-respect and universal approval at the same time. One always cancels the other. And the silent samurai chose respect, knowing that the cost was temporary, but the reward permanent.
Once self-respect becomes stable rather than reactive, something important changes. The social cost stops feeling like punishment and starts feeling like filtration, because what initially felt like rejection begins to reveal itself as refinement, removing noise, drama, and conditional connections from your life. And this is when the deeper benefits of self-respect emerge, not externally at first, but internally, as a calm authority that no longer seeks confirmation. Because when you stop compromising your values to preserve relationships, your nervous system settles, no longer oscillating between authenticity and appeasement. And this internal stability changes how you move, speak, and respond, making you less reactive and more deliberate. And people sense this shift immediately, even if they cannot explain it, because emotional chaos recognizes order instinctively, and order threatens chaos by existing. And this is where the second social cost appears, intimidation without intention, because calm self-respect can feel confrontational to those who rely on emotional volatility, oversharing, or manipulation to maintain influence. And this intimidation is not created by aggression, but by absence, the absence of hooks, the absence of neediness, the absence of emotional availability on demand. And this absence creates a vacuum where power dynamics change, because when you no longer need validation, others lose leverage, and loss of leverage triggers insecurity, projection, and passive resistance. But this phase is temporary, because insecurity cannot compete with consistency forever. And over time, those who resist your self-respect either adapt or exit completely, and both outcomes strengthen your environment, because respect cannot coexist with resentment long-term. One always outlasts the other. And this is why self-respect eventually simplifies your social world, reducing the number of people, but increasing the quality of interactions, because relationships grounded in mutual respect do not require constant maintenance, explanation, or emotional labor. They are light, stable, and honest. And this stability frees enormous mental energy previously spent managing perceptions, smoothing conflicts, and suppressing authenticity. And this freed energy compounds into focus, discipline, and self-mastery, creating a positive feedback loop where your internal order reinforces your external life.
And this is where the samurai thrived, in environments where every action aligned with a code, not because they sought control over others, but because they mastered themselves. And self-mastery is contagious, quietly attracting those who value strength, integrity, and clarity, while repelling those who thrive on chaos. And this attraction does not happen through charisma or persuasion, but through presence, because presence is what remains when insecurity is removed, and presence commands respect without demanding it. And this is when the social cost of self-respect flips into social return, not universal acceptance, but selective alignment, where fewer people enter your life, but those who do arrive with respect already established, eliminating the need for constant boundary enforcement. Because self-respect teaches others how to treat you before they even speak. And this is why boundaries enforced calmly are more effective than boundaries defended emotionally, because calm signals certainty, while defense signals doubt, and doubt invites testing, and testing invites exhaustion. And the samurai avoided this cycle by embodying their code consistently, never negotiating with behavior that violated it, not out of rigidity, but out of clarity, because clarity removes conflict at its root. And once you reach this level, disrespect becomes rare, not because people suddenly become kinder, but because those inclined to disrespect self-select out early, sensing the absence of emotional leverage. And this is the quiet power of self-respect. It changes who approaches you, who stays, and who fades away, without confrontation, without explanation, and without force. And while this may sound ideal, it requires patience, because the initial phase feels socially barren, a space between old connections dissolving and new ones forming. And this in-between space tests resolve, tempting you to compromise just enough to restore familiarity. But this is the moment where self-respect must be defended internally, not through action, but through restraint. The restraint to remain consistent even when loneliness whispers doubts, because loneliness is not proof of failure, it is proof of transition, and transitions are always uncomfortable because identity is reshaping, shedding old roles and expectations. And once this reshaping completes, self-respect no longer feels like something you practice, it feels like something you are, integrated into your posture, speech, and decisions. And at this stage, the social cost diminishes significantly, replaced by a quiet respect that follows you into rooms before you speak, because people sense when someone is internally aligned, and alignment creates trust, and trust creates influence without effort. And this influence is not dominance, but stability, the ability to remain grounded regardless of external noise. And this is the final lesson of the silent samurai, that self-respect is not a social strategy, it is a personal standard. And while it costs you comfort, approval, and familiarity at first, it repays you with clarity, peace, and unshakable identity. And once identity is secure, no social loss can threaten you, because you are no longer dependent on others to confirm your worth. And that independence is the ultimate form of freedom, not isolation, but self-sufficiency, the ability to stand alone without fear, knowing that any connection that enters your life from this point forward does so by choice, not necessity. And that is when self-respect stops being expensive and starts being priceless.
As self-respect hardens into identity rather than behavior, a more unsettling layer of the social cost reveals itself. The realization that much of what once felt like connection was actually regulation, a subtle system where your emotional reactions, availability, and compliance helped stabilize other people's insecurities. And when you remove yourself from that system by becoming self-directed, emotionally neutral, and internally anchored, you don't just lose approval, you expose dependency. And dependency does not dissolve peacefully, it resists quietly.
because people rarely admit they relied on you to absorb their uncertainty, and instead of gratitude for your growth, they experience a vague irritation they cannot name, because your self-respect interrupts patterns they unconsciously depended on, patterns where you over-explained, softened your truth, laughed at what diminished you, or stayed accessible to prevent discomfort. And when those behaviors stop, the emotional environment shifts, forcing others to confront feelings they were outsourcing to you. And most people avoid this confrontation at all costs because self-examination is painful. So rather than adapt, they reinterpret you as the problem, assigning motives like arrogance, coldness, or detachment to justify their discomfort. And this reinterpretation protects their self-image while quietly punishing your boundary. And this is where the darkness deepens, because self-respect doesn't just remove fake relationships, it reveals how conditional many bonds truly were, how much affection was contingent on your willingness to remain predictable, available, and emotionally malleable. And this realization can feel destabilizing because it forces you to grieve not just people, but illusions. The illusion that closeness was mutual, that care was unconditional, that loyalty was reciprocal, when in reality it was often transactional, and transactions collapse when terms change, and self-respect always changes the terms, because it withdraws emotional subsidies. And without those subsidies, some people feel exposed, smaller, and threatened. And threat triggers defense, not reflection, which is why self-respect attracts passive aggression more than open confrontation, because open confrontation requires accountability, while passive resistance allows denial. And this resistance can manifest as subtle exclusion, diminished warmth, sarcastic humor, or strategic silence, all designed to pressure you back into your former role without directly challenging your boundary. And this is one of the most psychologically taxing phases, because nothing is explicit, nothing can be addressed directly without appearing paranoid or overreactive. And the samurai endured this phase by cultivating emotional invisibility, not withdrawing from life, but withdrawing emotional responsiveness, refusing to chase clarity or closure, because closure is a luxury rarely granted when power dynamics shift, and demanding it only feeds the system trying to regulate you back into compliance. And this is where many people break, mistaking discomfort for danger, and return to old behaviors just to restore emotional warmth, unaware that warmth built on self-abandonment is not safety, it is sedation, and sedation eventually numbs identity, creating a hollow version of belonging that feels calm but erodes self-trust over time. And the silent samurai chose discomfort over numbness, because numbness is the true enemy, dulling perception and weakening resolve, while discomfort sharpens awareness and fortifies boundaries. And as you move through this darker layer, you begin to see social reality more clearly, recognizing how often kindness is conditional, how often tolerance is exploited, and how often harmony is maintained through silent self-sacrifice. And this clarity can feel isolating, even alienating, because once seen, it cannot be unseen, and you can no longer participate unconsciously in dynamics that require you to betray yourself. And this is where self-respect demands solitude, not as punishment, but as protection, a temporary withdrawal to allow identity to stabilize without constant pressure, because identity under construction is fragile, and exposure to manipulative dynamics during this phase can fracture it. And the samurai guarded this phase fiercely, limiting access, simplifying interactions, and prioritizing inner alignment over external validation, knowing that once identity solidifies, social dynamics lose their ability to destabilize. And this phase ends not with resolution, but with acceptance. Acceptance that not everyone will come with you, not everyone can meet you where you stand, and not everyone deserves continued access. And this acceptance is sobering because it removes the fantasy that self-respect will be rewarded immediately or universally, but it is also liberating because it frees you from negotiating your worth with those unwilling to recognize it. And once this negotiation ends internally, the external pressure loses its grip because pressure only works where doubt exists, and self-respect dissolves doubt at the root, even when it costs you familiarity, warmth, and perceived belonging, because what replaces them is something far more durable, self-trust. and self-trust is the foundation upon which all true strength is built.
In the final stage, self-respect reaches a point where it no longer feels defensive or corrective, but structural, embedded so deeply into your identity that it no longer reacts to social pressure. And this is where the cost transforms into consequence, because by now the people who relied on your compliance have either adapted or vanished, and the emotional noise surrounding your boundaries has quieted, leaving a sparse but stable social landscape. And while this landscape may appear empty compared to the past, it is clean, free from tension, manipulation, and unspoken expectations. And this cleanliness allows a new kind of presence to emerge, one that does not seek approval or resist rejection, because it no longer measures itself through social feedback. And this is the most threatening form of self-respect, independence. Because independence cannot be influenced through guilt, praise, or pressure. And people sense this immediately, often responding with cautious respect or distant admiration, because independence removes leverage entirely, and leverage is the foundation of most social games. And when the games end, so does unnecessary conflict, because there is nothing to contest. And this is where self-respect becomes magnetic rather than isolating, attracting individuals who are internally aligned rather than emotionally needy, people who respect boundaries intuitively because they have built their own. And these connections feel different, lighter, slower, and more grounded because they are not fueled by urgency or insecurity, but by choice. And choice is the highest form of connection because it is freely given, not extracted. And at this stage, the silent samurai no longer worries about being misunderstood because misunderstanding no longer threatens identity. And silence becomes comfortable, not because nothing needs to be said, but because nothing needs to be proven. And this inner stillness changes how life feels at a fundamental level, reducing anxiety, sharpening focus, and stabilizing emotion. Because much of anxiety was never about danger, but about social instability, the fear of losing connection if authenticity is expressed. And once self-respect eliminates that fear, the nervous system relaxes, conserving energy previously spent monitoring reactions, managing impressions, and anticipating rejection. And this conserved energy redirects into creation, discipline, and mastery, accelerating growth in ways that surprise even you, because growth without resistance compounds rapidly. And this is why self-respect ultimately expands your life rather than shrinking it, even though it initially feels like contraction. Because contraction is part of consolidation, the phase where strength is gathered inward before being expressed outward. And the samurai understood this rhythm: retreat before advance, solitude before leadership, silence before authority. And once the consolidation completes, self-respect no longer costs you socially. It defines your social reality, determining who enters, who stays, and who never gets close enough to destabilize you. And this selectivity is not arrogance, it is precision, the precision of someone who values their internal order more than external approval. And precision creates peace, because peace is not found by avoiding conflict, but by living in alignment so deeply that conflict has nowhere to attach. And this is the final truth most people never reach, that self-respect is not about being liked or disliked, accepted or rejected. It is about being coherent, internally consistent, and anchored, because coherence creates authority without effort, and authority attracts respect without demand. And when you reach this stage, the social cost of self-respect becomes irrelevant, because your sense of worth no longer fluctuates with social feedback, and you are free to engage or disengage without fear, to connect or withdraw without guilt, and to stand alone without feeling incomplete. And this freedom is quiet, almost invisible, but it changes everything.
because a person who does not fear social loss cannot be controlled, manipulated, or diminished, and that is why self-respect is rare. Not because people do not value it, but because few are willing to pay its price during the uncomfortable middle, the phase of misunderstanding, distance, and quiet resistance. And if you endure that phase without retreating, what awaits you is not isolation, but sovereignty, the ability to move through life with internal authority, grounded presence, and unwavering alignment. And that sovereignty is the ultimate reward of the silent samurai path, not dominance over others, but mastery over yourself, which renders all external judgment secondary and all social costs insignificant.